Hi again. This week we are talking about civil liberties, meaning the rights that you have that the government is not allowed to infringe upon. And so we're really specifically going through the First Amendment in these PowerPoints. And so last video, we talked about freedom of religion, which includes the freedom from establishment of religion, as well as the freedom to exercise your own religion. And now we're going to be talking about the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is one of the most enshrined pieces of American culture and American civil liberties. And the piece of the First Amendment that protects freedom of speech says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. That is a big protection, right? However, we know deep down somewhere that Congress and the state governments can make laws that abridge freedom of speech and the press. And so what kind of laws can you think of that actually abridge freedom of speech? Well, you can't yell fire in a crowded room if there is no fire. Making a bomb threat would be a violation of freedom of speech. You can't publish something in the press that would harm national security. So those are all examples of things that you cannot say, but yet the First Amendment still says that there can be no laws abridging the freedom of speech. Well, the court has gotten around this by saying some types of speech are actually not speech for the purposes of the Constitution. And these are libel and slander. We've talked about these. When you lie about somebody and say something malicious that's untrue in public, or you write it down and distribute it, those things are against the law. So those are types of what we would call speech that are not protected. Obscenity is also not protected. So you can think of the pornography industry, or remember we were talking about the violence in video games that they tried to ban based on obscenity. Those kinds of things can be banned because they're not considered legitimate speech. And so there are exceptions to our freedom of speech, but there are also very stringent protections. And the most stringent protections are on political speech. Political speech in the United States is one of our most fiercely guarded rights, and one of the rights that is most fiercely protected by the Supreme Court over and over and over again. It has only grown as time has gone on. We have more and more right to political speech. And so this includes criticism of public officials, and it can only be constrained when the speech threatens national security or people's safety. And the bar for if you're making political speech, the bar for threatening someone's safety is pretty high. It's pretty high. It wasn't always, but as I said, it's grown over time. So prior to the 1960s, we had what's called a clear and present danger test. And a lot of people have heard this phrase in passing, but didn't really know where it came from. The court established this test and asked the question in every case, whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about substantive evils. So my history buffs in the room will probably have their spidey senses tingling. What in the world is a substantive evil? Well, you guessed it, prior to the 1960s, we're probably talking about communism. We are probably talking about Nazis. We are probably talking about the Red Scare. And so this test was actually used to prevent political speech that was in support of communism, and allowed the government to persecute people who were either affiliated with the Communist Party or who were being blamed for being affiliated with the Communist Party. And so in the 1960s, we got through the Red Scare. We were over World War II at this point, and now we're thinking, okay, we need to protect political speech more than this. And so the idea was that they were prosecuting people who are handing out pamphlets about communism. Probably had to do with Karl Marx, and they were prosecuting them, and the person said, "This is a violation of my freedom of speech. I have political speech rights. They must be protected, even if you don't like the viewpoint of what I'm saying." So in 1969, the court established the imminent lawless action test. And the court ruled that as long as speech falls short of actually inciting action, it can't be prohibited. So even if it's hostile or subversive to the government and its policies, or even the Constitution itself, there must be a distinguishing line between advocacy and incitement to imminent lawless action. So you can go out and pass out your pamphlets that say horrible, terrible things. You can go out and make a speech, a political speech that is racist or homophobic or something like that. But the limit is, you can even say, let's overthrow the government. The government needs to be overthrown. Where the line is drawn is whether or not you've incited imminent lawless action. So instead of the government needs to be overthrown, you're saying you got a gun in your hand and you're like, let's go overthrow the government right now. Those are two different statements. And so it has to be imminent lawless action. And this is why things like conspiracy to commit murder can be illegal, even though it's just speech. It's because you've incited someone to imminent lawless action if you have asked them and paid them to commit an illegal action. There are some times when speech can be regulated, and just like when freedom of religious exercise can be regulated, we're again thinking about rules that regard the time, place, and manner of speech. But and so as particularly concerning the manner of the speech, however, it must be content neutral. It cannot discriminate based on the viewpoint of the speech. So if you are allowing people to have parades down Main Street, Silva, you need the licensure ability to be the same for the Girl Scouts as for the KKK. And for a lot of people that is shocking and sounds horrible, but the idea is that you can't discriminate based on the viewpoint. So if there are no guns, there's no violence, they are walking peacefully, the fact that the viewpoint of the KKK is racist and abhorrent does not mean they cannot have a parade down a main street. So laws against name calling, obscene speech, and hate speech are sometimes considered constitutional. The court is pretty hard on these when they end up getting to the Supreme Court, and because they must be content neutral. I'll take you back to the 60s again, in a case that happened in Virginia. There was a law in Virginia that stated that there can be no burning crosses or burning effigies that are intended to incite racial hatred. And the law came under suit because a Black family in a white neighborhood had their neighbors burnt a cross in their lawn, and clearly that was meant. Burning crosses have very strong figurative, symbolic meaning in the United States, and those are meant to incite racial hatred or to intimidate somebody, Black Americans, right? And so so they were arrested and charged under this statute. Well, the court said, yes, you can't burn something in your neighbor's yard, but it can't be it has to be content neutral, and to incite racial hatred is a viewpoint that is not allowed to be discriminated against. And so political speech has a broad umbrella, and it includes a lot of things that we would find not that shouldn't be part of political discourse, that are not good for American democracy, but we protect them because of this argument that it's a slippery slope. If you start discriminating against my viewpoint and you say, I can't do that, then what will prevent you from starting to take away freedom of speech rights in other places. When my viewpoint becomes unpopular, will you also take away my rights? And so that is why we protect, even to the point of allowing things that we think are abhorrent in political speech. Another aspect of this is student speech. And so we're talking about kids in public schools, we're not talking about student speech on campus, when of course as adults you have much more rights as students. But the Supreme Court still maintains that students don't shed their rights at the schoolhouse gate. So even though kids are on government property and they're being watched over by government officials who are teachers, they still have some free speech rights. And the first place that this started was in a case called Tinker. That's this bottom picture here with the black and white picture. Those kids wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War, and the school said it was a violation of dress code, and they said, no, it's my right as an American to have political free speech. And the court ended up saying that dress code rules had to be content neutral, so it can't be, you're not allowed to protest against a war, but also went so far as to say that they can only prohibit political speech if it is disruptive. And not that it's disruptive because it makes other people upset, but because it's disruptive in the very nature of the speech. So there's a little bit of a typo here, but at the bottom it should say speech may not be disruptive to others' educational experiences. So then the top picture here, bong hits for Jesus. This was another kid who I'm sure his parents are so proud, went to the Supreme Court saying that he got suspended or expelled for unrolling this poster at a parade on a school field trip. Well, this court, I think rightly made the line here and said, no, this is not political speech. So there's a number of reasons. For one, when you're on a field trip, you're still at school, so you can still have restricted free speech rights. If he had done this on his own time and he wasn't a field trip, no, he couldn't have gotten in trouble for saying something just ridiculous. Two, it's not really political speech because it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, you could make the argument that you're saying, marijuana policy is discriminatory, or marijuana, is a religious experience. I don't know, but really on its face, it just reads as like a dumb kid misbehaving on a field trip. So you can't say whatever you want, but your political speech is protected as long as it's not disruptive. Symbolic speech is also protected. So for your speech to be protected, it does not have to be just something you say. It can be a lot of things. So for example, down here on the right corner with the expletive, this case was, again, in the 60s about Vietnam War, where a man wore an F the draft jacket into a courthouse, and he was arrested for disturbing the peace, I believe. And he argued that that was his right as an American to say, to protest against the draft. Now, if it had said something besides the draft, something not political, it might not have been as severely protected, but because it was about a political issue, it was. Over on the right here, pray for more dead soldiers. This is the Willsboro Baptist Church, and they go and protest soldiers' funerals. Particularly gay soldiers' funerals, and say that God is punishing America because we're allowing homosexuality to people who are in same-sex relationships to have the same rights as everyone else, and allowing gay and lesbian people to be in the military. And they're protesting all of this and saying God wants all of them to die, and that God is punishing us. And they were, of course, you can regulate the time, place, and manner of those protests, but you can't regulate them more than other protests just because we find what they're saying to be so offensive. Finally, burning the American flag is constitutional. I'm going to ask you that on the exam. The banning of the burning of the American flag is unconstitutional, meaning the government cannot tell you you cannot burn a flag. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, but the most important reason is that it is an inherently political speech that does not harm anyone. Um, it might harm your sensibilities and we might not like it, but it is political speech, protesting against the American government, what America stands for. That is all perfectly legal, and to ban it is unconstitutional. So the only way it could be ruled that you can ban the American flag is to put it in a constitutional amendment. And there are members of Congress every single year who bring it up to ban it that as a constitutional amendment, and it never gets passed, and it's never obviously ratified. And so make sure you know that it is illegal to ban burning of the flag. And I'll usually have someone in ROTC or a military personnel point out in class that to officially like retire a flag, you burn it. And so if it was allowed in that case and not allowed as a protest, that is the definition of discriminating against a speech based on its viewpoint. And so just remember that. Finally, sort of talk about internet as a forum for freedom of speech. We know that people say whatever, whenever they want on the internet, all the way from our elected officials to people in basements who don't have anything better to do but be mean to people online. But it's largely unregulated and it's largely unable to be regulated. And so we can have really positive discourse online, we can have really negative discourse online. But that does remind me to bring up the final point that I like to remind students that your freedom of speech and most of your other civil liberties are not freedom to do and say whatever you want, whenever you want, without consequences. It is the freedom to say, particularly anything political, without being punished by the government. So when people are at their dinner table spewing hateful things and someone says, please stop, you don't say, but it's my freedom of speech, I can say whatever I want. Well, then I'm going to ask you to leave. I'm not violating your freedom of speech by not allowing people to say whatever, whenever, and not, making boundaries and having consequences. The same thing goes for your relationships at work. If, there's a rule that you can't have political speech in your company, and you do, then that could very well lead to firing, and you'd have to make a really good case that was illegal, or you could just be fired. Particularly saying things that aren't political that can get you fired at work, or get you in trouble at like in a private school or a private college. Those types of places are just not protected, and it's certainly not protected among your friends and your family. If you say something political that hurts your mama's feelings, it's not a good enough argument that you have freedom of speech as an American, because you also have the duty and obligation to be a decent human being. So go out there, be nice, and use your freedom of political speech wisely but fiercely.